Welcome to the History Extra podcast. Fascinating historical conversations from the makers of BBC History magazine. What was it like to breastfeed a baby in the Middle Ages? Well, in today's episode, historian Hannah Skoda shares her research on breastfeeding during the Middle Ages with Emily Briffett. From what medieval medics believed breast milk was made of, to ethical issues surrounding wet nursing, and how people at the time felt about the big debates that still surround breastfeeding today.
Hi Hannah, thank you so much for joining us on the History Extra podcast.
Thank you for asking me. It's a real pleasure to be here.
Today we are going to be travelling back to the Middle Ages to talk about breastfeeding in this period, both the experience of the mother and child, but also the community around them. Now, I wanted to start by asking you, was breastfeeding something that was much spoken about in the Middle Ages, or was it kept quite hush-hush?
Yeah, it's such an interesting question. And yes, people did talk about breastfeeding. I think nowadays we have this weird sort of conflict or tension between, on the one hand, a huge pressure on women to breastfeed, and medically it's great for babies to be breastfed. But we also have this kind of prudishness about, mustn't show breasts, and it can feel very embarrassing, sort of breastfeeding your baby. In public, there are some strange taboos. And I don't think that kind of tension really exists in the Middle Ages, actually. People don't have that kind of prudishness about it. And they're very clear that the best thing for the baby is to be breastfed. So we find lots of advice in medical treatises about why breastfeeding is great for the babies. It does tend to be about the babies, not about the mothers, which is not a huge change from now, I think, in terms of how people talk about it. And of course, all those medical treatises are written by men as well. Equally, in moral literature and in religious literature, there's a lot of material about breastfeeding and why this is a great thing to do. Though very interestingly, in these treatises, they talk both about how breastfeeding is the best thing to do, but they then do go on to say, but if you must use a wet nurse, this is the best way to select your wet nurse. So there's a sort of assumption that, this isn't going to necessarily work out for a whole range of reasons. But the other thing to point out is that in the Middle Ages, people are confronted all the time by images of the Virgin Mary breastfeeding Jesus. So this idea of the image of what we call the Madonna lactans, the breastfeeding Virgin Mary. So there's a really strong sense that, it's right there at the heart of society, and people are quite willing to talk about it and confront it and look at it.
So you're saying there about the use of the images of the Virgin Mary. Was breastfeeding something that was idealised and perhaps eulogised in the Middle Ages then?
Yes, I think absolutely. I think there's a really strong sense of breastfeeding as this kind of great ideal, and particularly the image of the Virgin Mary as the kind of ideal woman to whom everyone else should be aspiring, which is, of course, quite a problematic message in the sense that everything goes swimmingly for the Virgin Mary. So she has a totally pain-free childbirth, and she never has any problems getting her baby to latch on and this kind of thing. So I think in many ways that ideal was sort of construed in such a way as to make ordinary women feel pretty inadequate most of the time. So actually there's quite a kind of problematic dimension to it.
Was breastfeeding at this time something that was purely for practical purposes, or was there a more emotional side to it?
That's really interesting. I think there's a very profoundly emotional side to it. I think there's a really clear sense that breastfeeding produces a kind of intimacy between mother and child. One of the ways that we know that is because they use breastfeeding as a metaphor so often. So the university as an institution might be described as a mother breastfeeding her children, which is perhaps slightly weird. And there are other contexts too in which people will talk about nurturing maternal milk and this sort of thing. In contexts where they're not remotely talking about mother-child relationships, but there's such a sense that this is a kind of emotional ideal. But in very practical terms, and thinking about the subjective experience of mothers themselves, I think there's a really clear sense that this produces a particular kind of affection and a particular relationship. But, and there is a big but, I think we nowadays think of this almost exclusively in terms of a kind of mother-child dyad, that this is about a kind of beautiful vision of a mother with the child on her breast, and it's all about those two individuals. But in the Middle Ages, I think there's a much wider sense of kind of drawing in other people to that relationship. So breastfeeding is not just about the mother and the child. It's about the whole family, and it's about the wider community, and it might be about wet nurses, and it might be about relations and milk sharing. So all the kind of emotional connotations aren't just about the mother-child relationship. They're actually about the loving relations, which should characterize a whole community in the ideal.
Why was this involvement of the wider community and the wider family in these prized moments between mother and child deemed so important?
I think it's partly just a kind of practical sense. The first thing to say is that, breastfeeding can be really hard. For some lucky women, it just works out just like that. But in many ways, even though it's such a natural process, it's something that you kind of have to work at. And you need the support of other women who've already done it, or you need the support of men who are around to bring you a glass of water, or people know that actually it's not something which means you just sit down with your child on your own. It all works much better if you have a community of people around helping out. And we have lots of examples in the Middle Ages of women helping each other, particularly when new mothers are kind of struggling to get their children to latch on. Other women coming along and sort of showing them how it's done, or of women milk sharing when, one might be struggling to produce enough milk or something. So there is a really, really strong sense just of necessity of kind of drawing in a wider group of people. I think the other thing to say might be that actually this sense of a kind of exclusive mother-child dyad, it's not really how it works nowadays either, but I think it's how it gets portrayed nowadays very often, particularly visually. And I think that's probably the historical anomaly. So it's not what it looks like in the Middle Ages. And I think it's not what it looks like in most societies throughout the world. So if you were to talk to anthropologists about breastfeeding, I think you'd get a similar sense that actually very often this is part of a sort of wider network. It's got a kind of wider family, a wider community involved. I had a really fascinating paper recently about breastfeeding in pre-colonial Maori society. And that was absolutely intriguing in terms of partly just the kind of elevation of the idea of nurturing. It was really, really beautiful. But at the same time, this sense that it's not just about kind of heaping all the onus on mothers, but actually a much broader sense of responsibility and implication of the whole community.
I'd really like to delve into medieval breastfeeding practices in a little while, but first I think I need to ask, what did medieval medical professionals think breast milk was? What was their understanding of it?
So they have a really interesting sense of the ways in which the breast milk kind of interacts with everything else that's going on in the mother's body. And it's seen as an extension of the ways in which the child is nourished in the womb. We're talking about a period when people believe in the four humours and how the body needs to kind of regulate those four humours in order to function properly. And they believe that that kind of regulation of the humours also shapes the ways in which the breast milk comes out. So the kind of complexion in a sort of emotional, personality-wise sense of the mother is apparently going to be transmitted to the child as they breastfeed.
So this is one of almost the special effects that breast milk was believed to have. Were there perhaps any other special effects or benefits?
So they believe that breast milk has the potential to produce particular traits in the children who they are nourishing. They also believe that it is much healthier for the child in ways which have different explanations from the ways that we think about breast milk now, but kind of amount to the same thing, that they're very clear that this is the most nourishing thing that can happen to a child in order to protect against disease, in order to enable them to grow big and strong, etc. Things become really complicated and problematic when people start using wet nurses who might be from a different ethnic background to the biological mothers of the children. And there we then find a really unpleasant, disingenuous kind of set of anxieties and arguments to think through the ways in which certain wet nurses might have certain implications then for the babies that they're breastfeeding. So there's a constant sort of tension actually between the kind of pull of convenience and price and who they want to do the wet nursing, and the ways in which societies are becoming increasingly racist, really, in the ways that they're thinking about different groups. And we're really now sort of talking into the 15th century, I think. There are also some kind of strange beliefs which sound very odd to us now. So we now know that colostrum, which is the kind of milk that mothers produce immediately after giving birth, and which is absolutely essential for those first moments of a baby's life, they believed that colostrum was poisonous. And it does kind of, as it comes out, it looks kind of curdled and gross. So you can sort of see where they're coming from, but they were very, very wrong. And so extraordinary cases of, hiring old ladies to kind of suck the colostrum off a new mother's breast before she then feeds her own baby, sort of 3 days later. But to us, that all really does sound very strange and problematic.
So let's talk a little bit about the practice of breastfeeding. You're saying that they started to breastfeed maybe 3 days after. For how long did a mother or somebody equivalent to a mother breastfeed for? Does this sort of comply with maybe modern standards?
Yes, this is really interesting because I think many mothers now get told, try to breastfeed for a year. That's a really good way to kind of set your child up in life, and a year is sort of held up as like the kind of gold standard. But the World Health Organization now says 2 years. And actually, again, to go back to the kind of strange tensions that we face in the 21st century now, I think there's a sense that, with a little baby under a year, there's a huge pressure to breastfeed. After they're a year old, there's actually a bit of a taboo on breastfeeding, and mothers who continue, quote unquote, to do extended breastfeeding get some rather sort of strange looks, and that taboo is quite present, which goes against the grain of those World Health Organization guidelines. Anyway, in the Middle Ages, people do seem to think 2 years is about the right length of time. So that's really interesting that sort of goes against the grain of this taboo that we see in modern society, but it is actually in line with modern health guidelines. And our evidence for this doesn't just come from medical treatises. I've been looking at miracle collections. So these are collections of stories about miraculous cures wrought by saints or the bodies of saints after their deaths. And these collections get put together because people need to prove that this person should genuinely be a saint because they've made all these miracles. So they're wonderful sources because they tend to include details of miracles produced for those right across the social spectrum. So you get peasants going to the body of a potential saint begging for a miracle. You get artisans, you get merchants, you might get aristocrats. So we get this incredible sort of textured picture of society. Anyway, and there are quite a lot of miracle stories about resuscitated infants. Obviously, it's a period of very high infant mortality. And I think we tend to assume that because infant mortality was so high that perhaps people didn't care as much. And that's the most appalling assumption to make. People, I think, were devastated when they lost their children. And one of the ways to show that is that they would take their children, their bodies, or sometimes they would measure the length of the body and take that to the shrine of a saint and beg for a miraculous cure. So people really cared. And quite often these stories have details about breastfeeding. And these give us little insights into the practicalities, the really everyday sort of practicalities that medical treatises didn't really need to mention because that's just what people did. But it helps us to see the kind of, the everyday texture of it in really fascinating ways.
That's a really interesting point to make. It's almost myth busts our perceptions of the medieval period, saying that actually they did feel the loss in the same way that we would. I think we don't always think about it that way. I wanted to touch on a point that you said about the debates almost that we have today about breastfeeding. And another big debate that we have today is about whether it's best to feed children on demand or according to a strict routine. Did medieval people had have the same debates.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I found this really refreshing when studying the medieval material, because when my children were little, I remember all the stuff about routines, and it was so stressful. And we didn't really have a routine. I just fed them on demand. And in the Middle Ages, they don't really debate it particularly. It's not a thing like, should one have a routine, or should you just respond to your baby crying? So again, the medical treatises don't really give us too much here, because I think they just sort of assume you just get on with it. But again, the miracle stories do give us some really wonderful insights. And there are stories where you do get a sense of how a mother went to feed her child because she heard him crying, or a mother went to feed her child because she had a spare moment, or the child was crawling out of the door, so she grabs him and gets her breast out. So this sense that it's something that you just kind of do when the moment arises really comes out very clearly from these stories. And you get such a sense of the kind of intimacy and the care. So there's a lovely story of a little boy who crawls off and falls into the moat of Conwy Castle in North Wales. I really love this story because I used to live near there anyway, so it felt very personal. And anyway, so that's tragic, and his parents are absolutely devastated, and the sort of implication is that his mother wasn't watching him properly. But it's not done in a kind of guilt-trippy sort of way. It's more like the story sort of presents this woman who has to sort the washing out and do the cooking and watch her other children and make the bed, and she's just stressed out with all this stuff she's got to do. And anyway, a passerby notices, and they rescue the child from the moat, and then they pray to the saint, and then the child is brought back to life, and then she suckles the child. But as she suckles the child, her husband is right there, and the wider community is all around as well. And everybody's sort of involved in that act of breastfeeding, which obviously has nothing to do with the routine. It's just because she's got her baby back and she just wants to feed him, and everybody wants to be part of that kind of emotional bond.
So I feel like this is something you've perhaps answered in your last answer, but was it then deemed appropriate and acceptable to breastfeed in public?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And again, a question that I think we really obsess about now. And I think it's really problematic and kind of hypocritical now that women are faced both with the pressure to breastfeed and this sense that, you know, in many cases you really are kind of looked at askance if you breastfeed in public. It's just not really a debate in the Middle Ages, so you don't really find it in the medical treatises particularly. And in these miracle collections, there's no sense that women are kind of embarrassed just to breastfeed their children when they need it. And I think, again, it's really interesting that all those images of the Madonna lactans, of the breastfeeding Virgin Mary, are really explicit about Mary's breasts. Like, they're right out there, sometimes anatomically looking very strange, actually, at quite odd angles. But, you know, there's no sense that it needs to be covered up and hidden. I think a really interesting moment comes in the 16th century, actually, when particularly in a Catholic context, obviously in a Protestant context, people aren't depicting Mary all the time, but in a Catholic context, during the Council of Trent in the second part of the 16th century, there is much more anxiety about showing breasts. And you see this kind of prudishness starting to emerge. And what's really fascinating then is the way that painters, artists have to find new ways of showing that Mary is the perfect mother breastfeeding her child, but without showing those breasts any longer. So we can see the ways in which this kind of tension starts to emerge, I think, in the second half of the 16th century, in a way that's just not there in the Middle Ages. They're just fine with it, really.
The last modern day big debate I'd really like to touch on in this medieval context is about the use of formula. So today, for mothers who, for whatever reason, can't or choose not to breastfeed, they have this option. What was the medieval equivalent? Was there one?
So formula as we know it is invented, I think, in 1860. And so it feels like a really kind of modern phenomenon. There are medieval equivalents, so it's not perhaps the kind of crucial moment that some people might see it as. So in the Middle Ages, people would sometimes use something called pap, which is made in different ways, but it's basically like ground up grain and water. There are some cases of using animal milk, but I think they're quite aware that's really very problematic. So really, if a mother can't or doesn't want to breastfeed her own children, her own biological children, the assumption is generally that if it's within people's means, a wet nurse will be used. And if it's not within their means, there are actually a number of cases of milk sharing, and probably a huge number of cases of milk sharing that we just don't know about in peasant communities, because how would we know about this kind of thing? I think this kind of history is confronted with the problem that, something that is so much part of who we are as human beings, we just don't think to write about it. Which is why these miracle collections are so exciting, because we do get these mentions. But on the whole, it's really hard to know about the really kind of everyday stuff.
So what exactly is the difference between milk sharing and wet nursing?
So milk sharing is just where another woman would be happy to share the milk that she's producing with the infant of a different biological mother, whereas wet nursing implies that there's a kind of contractual dimension to this, that somebody is remunerated. Of course, many of the wet nurses in the Middle Ages are enslaved women. It's a very distressing and uncomfortable history. This isn't the case in England, by the way. Late medieval slavery is a feature of Southern Europe in this period. So obviously we're not there talking about these women being remunerated at all. They're not. They're being exploited in really horrific ways. But I think generally we would describe them as wet nurses, because the idea is it's got this kind of economic dimension to it.
What do we know about their experience?
Yeah, so we have quite a lot of really interesting insights into what it was like for wet nurses themselves. We have examples of wet nurses who were clearly very distressed to have to use their milk to feed another child rather than their own. And wet nurses officially should not be continuing to feed their own biological children. I think many of them must have been continuing to feed their own children alongside the children who they were paid or contracted or obliged to feed. But there are cases where there is a significant amount of distress. There are also cases, though, where we see amazing emotional bonds developing between the children and the wet nurses. And one of the ways that we can kind of get at that sort of history is through will evidence. So examples in wills where people are leaving something special to the woman who wet nursed them when they were little. That's a really moving insight into the ways in which these relationships might actually have endured. There's also a really interesting case which has been worked on in detail by Erin Maglacki of women employed as wet nurses in the areas in the countryside around Florence, in particular in Italy. So the Foundling Hospital in Florence, which was the institution for children whose parents couldn't afford to look after them or whose parents had died, so babies would just be left at the Foundling Hospital. It would employ wet nurses from the countryside around Florence to nourish those children until they were a certain age, and then they'd be brought back to the Foundling Hospital. It's actually a rather amazing institution, in many ways horrible and inhumane, but in other ways actually extremely altruistic and suggesting something about Florentine society and its sense of responsibility for these babies, which is very striking. Anyway, the women who were wet nursing these children, it seems possible that in some cases they were actually the mothers of the children who'd been left at the hospital, who couldn't afford to keep them themselves, and who would then try to kind of wangle it so they would then get their own child back to wet nurse. The hospital is very, very keen to make sure that this doesn't happen. So they do what they can to ensure that children are being sent to different wet nurses other than their biological mothers, because they don't want people, what they see as kind of exploiting the system. But these mothers come up with all kinds of strategies. And it's really rather amazing. So there's an example of wet nursing where women are kind of strategizing in these awful circumstances where, you know, they're all really struggling to survive, by kind of swapping the babies around who they've been given to wet nurse in the hope that they might end up with their own baby. And of course, it tells us something really important as well about the idea of paid and unpaid labour, which I think is something that feminists now are still trying to think about, that breastfeeding is essentially unpaid labour. And not least that produces really great kind of economic inequities in terms of who can afford to breastfeed their children for extended periods and who can't. And that question then of paid and unpaid labour is sort of shaping the ways in which these women are dealing with it in the countryside around medieval Florence too, in really amazing ways.
This is quite an intimate and heartbreaking in many ways part to the story. So could you tell us, why did people choose to use wet nurses, and who actually had that choice?
I think it's a really good question, and we can think about it in different ways as well. So in sermons and kind of pastoral moral literature generally, there are all kinds of derogatory comments about women who choose to use wet nurses. So there's lots of men kind of fulminating about, how these women are so vain and they don't want to get droopy breasts, or these women are, just not prepared to put in the work to breastfeed their own children. And, maybe that was the case in some cases. And certainly, actually, a lot of women in a certain social position were, under enormous pressure to continue to look absolutely perfect. That's sort of where their status lay. So that's all a bit more complicated. There's also a really clear sense that they believe breastfeeding works as contraceptive. And so there's a sense that, you really, if you want to have another baby quickly, don't breastfeed. So send your children out, particularly for aristocratic women who, need to kind of assure their lineage and make sure that lots of babies are produced. Send the babies out to be wet nursed as quickly as possible, because then you can conceive again as quickly as possible. So there's a really strong sense that actually this is bound up in those kind of reproductive pressures on women. At the same time, I don't think wet nursing is just something for aristocratic women. This is a period, obviously, of very, very high maternal mortality as well. So in many cases, wet nurses are being used simply because the mother has died in childbirth. So, there's a really, really practical dimension to the need for wet nurses. And I suppose for those lower down the social spectrum, this is where we need to think about kind of networks of milk sharing as well, and the ways in which communities would kind of rally round in many cases to support families where the mother had died. I should say, I'm making it all sound really idyllic, and the Middle Ages sound as though everybody loved each other and they all supported each other so beautifully. And very clearly that's not the case. These are communities fraught with all kinds of tensions. But there are plenty of cases where it does work in this very supportive way. And I think we have quite a lot to learn from that, actually.
To follow on from that, do you think perhaps that medieval practices can help inform us today?
Yes, I really do. I mean, the most uplifting dimension of all of this is to think about the real sense of intimacy and love which characterises lots of these stories. Obviously, the miracle collections, which I'm particularly interested in, are always going to be about the mothers who adored their children, because those are the stories which made it into these collections. They're kind of self-selecting, of course, but they nevertheless give us a really, really interesting insight into the centrality of breastfeeding in those kind of emotional connections. I think all this material provides us with some really interesting questions and challenges to think with now as well, though. They don't give us any answers and there aren't any straightforward parallels, but these questions and challenges are quite pressing. So the prevalence of wet nursing in the Middle Ages is a really useful lens to think about the relationship between paid and unpaid labour in motherhood now, and the kind of economic inequities that produces. So economic inequities between women at different parts of the kind of economic spectrum, but equally inequities in a straightforwardly gendered sense. It provides us with a series of challenges to think with as well, I think. We have a really kind of strong sense now that this is all about mother and baby. All the pressure is on the mother to do the very, very best she can for her baby. And of course, mothers want to do that. But I think that the kind of challenge thrown up for us by thinking about breastfeeding in different societies, and in this case in the Middle Ages, is that there is a much stronger sense of community involvement and the role of fathers as well. And I'm not saying that communities aren't supportive now or that fathers aren't involved. Of course, I'm not saying that. But it does give us a really useful way of sort of challenging some of our assumptions. And and trying to see breastfeeding as sort of being at the heart of something which we're doing as a society. We're all trying to nurture the next generation, and we're all kind of responsible there.
One of the things you touched on earlier was how medieval guidance and practice was all about caring for the infant. But obviously, as we've been speaking, one of the things that you've really highlighted is actually how much this can tell us about the experience of women at this time. I wonder if you could share with us a few interesting points about this that you found out in your research.
It's very striking, isn't it, that when we talk about breastfeeding and when we look to what people in the Middle Ages had to say about breastfeeding, it is all about the well-being of infants. And of course, that's right. That's how one would want it. And, you know, what mother doesn't want to think about the well-being of her infant? But it is very striking that the well-being of mothers is rarely part of the conversation in the Middle Ages. Anyway, I think that tells us something pretty important about the ways in which women find themselves kind of instrumentalized or used to nurture the next generation and to produce the next generation as well. So this sense that women are kind of a tool, I think, is sort of reflected in all this stuff which just doesn't talk about the experience of the mothers themselves. But as historians, we can look at the experience of the mothers themselves, and we can find all kinds of hints and insights into the ways mothers felt about this. So we can find examples of, I found an example recently of a woman from southern France who really did not want to accept help from a kinswoman who was offering to share her milk because the biological mother was not quite producing enough. She didn't want to accept it, presumably because she felt she wanted to be the one to nurture her infant. So we get there, I think, a really interesting sense of what it felt like for this woman in this horrible position of not quite being able to nourish her child, but being desperate to be the one to do it.
Why do you think it's so important that we touch on the story of breastfeeding throughout history?
I think there are lots of reasons. I mean, firstly, it's really fascinating. I think it has a kind of intrinsic interest, which is really moving, actually, that, you know, we can really get a sense of the experiences of individual people in the past, right across the social spectrum, doing this most essential task of nurturing the next generation. I think it provides a really important corrective to the sense that people didn't really care about their children in the Middle Ages. You know, this sense that high infant mortality meant that people were just like, whatever. I think that's an appalling kind of interpretation and really ethically problematic one. And this evidence shows that people really, really cared about their children. In terms of what we can learn now, though, I think that in the kind of pressure to breastfeed now, for women for whom it doesn't work out, for a whole host of reasons, whether they be medical reasons or economic reasons or cultural reasons, I think it can feel very, very isolating. And I think to realise that in the past, in pre-industrialised societies, women didn't just straightforwardly pop babies out all the time and whack them on their breasts and it was all completely unproblematic and fine. To realise that life wasn't like that women in the past faced a huge range of challenges and that they responded to them in ways which were emotionally textured and really moving. I think that's an important lesson for us now, so we can feel those points of connection and feel less isolated and be more mutually supportive. And think about the next generation in ways which are altogether richer.
Thank you. I think that was a wonderful point to leave us on. Thank you so much, Hannah.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for asking me.